Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Age Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my top 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, I'm going to be giving you guys my perspective and opinions as to how I personally believe the wide receiver position currently stacks up. We're going to be talking about the statistics that truly separate wide receivers from one another, and we're going to be doing this at a half PPR scoring format. Again, we're trying to meet everyone in the middle in a balanced scoring format. Again, for those of you who play in a standard, those of you who play in a full PPR, my apologies in advance, but in order to meet everyone in the middle, we're going to be talking about it in a half PPR capacity. Now, again, before we begin today's video and I start breaking down some statistics and the players I truly do like for this upcoming season, I got to remind you guys, rankings are always subject to change. Again, this is something I mentioned in yesterday's video, and again, thank you for the outpour of support that you guys certainly showed me yesterday, coming back with my first piece of content. I appreciate that a lot, guys. It really does warm my heart. But regardless, in terms of rankings being subject to change, Carson Wentz, official news, he's going to be out for 12 weeks. He's going to be having surgery on that ankle. That certainly plays a huge role in what Jonathan Taylor is going to look like and how he could be potentially approached this upcoming season. Again, their early part of their schedule is relatively tough in terms of the defenses they have to play against. Everything is subject to change. So make sure you keep that in mind, regardless of what you see on screen today. It could change in the coming weeks. But either way, we're going to be talking about some guys before we get into mock drafts later in the week to kind of give you my perspective. Now, again, I want to once again thank you guys for the support that you guys have shown me. If you have not yet already, click that subscribe button. We're going to be making fantasy football content here on the channel for the entirety of the 2021 season. That's up until Sunday of week 18, which is January 9th. I mean, every single day, maybe even multiple times a day, I'm going to be trying to produce as much content as I possibly can. So again, click that subscribe button, free content here, talking about fantasy football every single day. You will not regret it again. So without further ado, now we can finally get into my top 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Again, there were a couple names and a couple players that I really kind of went back and forth on at the number 10 spot, but I eventually kind of fell into place with Terry McLaurin. The honorable mention that I actually want to kind of give a little bit of credence to is, of course, Allen Robinson. Allen Robinson, the Chicago Bears, is a great option at the number 10 spot, and I'm sure many of you guys would probably have him. Again, for those of you who are listening to this right now, go down in the comment section. Let me know which you guys have as your top 10 wide receivers. Even before you even watch this video, I'm curious what your guys' opinions are at the wide receiver position in a half PPR scoring capacity, even if you have to do it for a standard or a full PPR. It's great to kind of know what the public opinion is, because there are some guys here that certainly have guys way higher than others, and I'm of course trying to pry into information and see what you guys know that I already don't. But either way, Terry McLaurin, he's going into his third year in the NFL. He is a younger wide receiver playing for the Washington football team, and though in his first couple of seasons of his career, the quarterback talent hasn't been there. I mean, he's played with the likes of Dwayne Haskins, Kyle Allen, Alex Smith, Taylor Heineke, Case Keenum, Colt McCoy, and that's just in the past 2 years. There's been a carousel at the quarterback position for the Washington football team, and hopefully by bringing in Ryan Fitzpatrick, Fitzmagic in specific, they can go ahead and lock this down and give Terry McLaurin far more value in a fantasy football perspective. Now, in the last 2 seasons, again, he's finished as the number 21 wide receiver and the number 27 wide receiver. Again, not too much opportunity going in his direction, but I really do believe this is a breakout season in the midst prior to getting into 2021 for Terry McLaurin, and I'll tell you why. Ryan Fitzpatrick brings a lot of value to the number 1 wide receiver of whatever team he ended up playing for. I mean, specifically, in the last 2 seasons, he's played for the Miami Dolphins. And to be honest, the Miami Dolphins, yes, they've kind of gotten hot over the last couple seasons, winning a lot of games. Brian Flores going down there, an incredible head coach, has kind of locked it down and changed the culture for the Miami Dolphins, for the better, of course. Again, Adam Gase was not doing well a couple years back with them. But regardless, Ryan Fitzpatrick was able to go into that organization, and he was able to make a wide receiver one out of nothing. I mean, Davante Parker, a guy that for majority of his career did not end up at least producing up to the standard of play that everyone kind of anticipated, especially considering his draft capital coming out of college. He had incredible numbers with Ryan Fitzpatrick. I mean, in 2019, from weeks 6 through 17, when Ryan Fitzpatrick had truly taken over reign of the quarterback position. Again, this is basically after Josh Rosen had failed and they had kind of washed him down. They're like, all right, we're going to go ahead and give Fitzpatrick the reins. From week 6 through 17 in the 2019 season, Davante Parker averaged 14.92 fantasy points per game with 8.67 targets per game. I mean, those statistics alone are just, some of the magic that Fitz is bringing to that offense. Again, the number one wide receiver is always going to produce when Fitz magic is there because he's a gunslinger. He's a guy that's not afraid of making mistakes. I mean, look at how many teams he's been on in the National Football League and look how much experience he's had. He's going to throw the ball and he's going to try to get the ball, of course, to Terry McLaurin. This entire offseason has been a combination of growing chemistry between the two because Curtis Samuel, who they brought in this offseason as a free agent from the Carolina Panthers, he's been dealing with a groin injury. So it's been Fitz and McLaurin. I truly do believe this is going to elevate McLaurin. Now, again, Ryan Fitzpatrick did not play as many games as he did in 2019, in 2020, but nonetheless, him and Davante Parker, when in fact they were both in the game together, were still a pretty dynamic duo, averaging 11 plus fantasy points per game and 8.42 targets per game. Again, I mentioned the targets because opportunity is a huge part of the wide receiver position, and it plays a huge role, especially for a wide receiver like Terry McLaurin, who's trying to come from the wide receiver 2 range into the top 10 conversation. Now, when we talk about what Terry McLaurin has done in the last 2 seasons of his career, again, his rookie and sophomore year, he's averaged 11.83 fantasy points per game in 29 total games. In 14 of those games, he's had 8 plus targets, which again, that's great. In 6 of those games, 100 plus receiving yards. And of course, he's had 11 total touchdowns in his career thus far. The quarterback play has not been great, but I think now that you bring in Fitz, you get a little bit more stability. I know Taylor Heineke's still on the team, but I think the reason they brought in Fitz is because they want to win now. I mean, this is a team that was in the playoffs and competed pretty well with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, defending champions, in the first wild card round. So let's not take it out of proportions, but the Washington football team is looking to compete, and they think they found that with their quarterback as of right now with Ryan Fitzpatrick. Now, the thing that Terry McLaurin really needs to address this upcoming season, of course, target share hopefully can go up. I mean, he had 134 targets this past year, having ran 625 routes. He only had, been targeted 21.44% of the time that he ran a route last year. In terms of total target share from the team, only 23.1%. I expect those numbers to go up with Fitzpatrick. Again, he really does love to feed his number one guy, and that's definitely going to be McLaurin. Now, in terms of another statistic that he certainly needs to improve on, because he is great in terms of average depth of target, he is a deep ball threat at all times, touchdowns. We all know that touchdowns make a huge difference at the wide receiver position, and looking what he's done in the last 2 seasons, 25 total targets within the red zone for 4 touchdowns, not great, but a guy like Davante Parker having himself 30 targets in the red zone and 9 receiving touchdowns just with Fitzpatrick alone is a big deal. Either way, I really do think that Terry McLaurin is going to be the Chris Godwin and or Calvin Ridley of this upcoming season. Guys that were, pretty much a mid wide receiver 2, not really finding much traction, dealing with injuries earlier in their career, and is finally going to be given the opportunity to have that breakout season. I think this is the year for Terry McLaurin. That is why he sits at my number 10. We move on to our number 9. It is A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. Now, the thing that I want to first and foremost mention, A.J. Brown is an unbelievable, just not even just fantasy prospect, but just athlete as a whole. This offseason, A.J. Brown revealed a little bit of information to the public that we were not keen of throughout the entirety of the 2020 season. He had 2 significant knee injuries that he had played through for the entire year. In fact, he was told by the team doctor that he'd pretty much be done at week 2 of last season. If you guys remember, A.J. Brown did miss 2 games last season in week 2 and 3 after the first game against Denver, which I'm assuming he sustained that injury. But again, they had told him his season's probably done. Both knees had to have surgery, and he did have surgery this offseason on both knees. But regardless of the pain and what he had to go through all of last season, he finishes the number 11 wide receiver with only 14 games played. The season prior, again, the number 15 overall wide receiver. A.J. Brown is a stud, and the reason why that is, besides, of course, his athleticism, his physique, and his ability to just dominate secondaries, it's Ryan Tannehill. As soon as Ryan Tannehill, similar to Derrick Henry like we talked about yesterday, as soon as Ryan Tannehill took over this offense, everybody excelled. Of course, Tannehill did it himself, but A.J. Brown became a different animal altogether. He was averaging, barely 10 points per game. He had a huge game against Atlanta, but as soon as Ryan Tannehill took over, A.J. Brown became a relevant wide receiver option every single week. And, from then has averaged 14.88 fantasy points per game. In the 24 games that they've played together, it's just been magic. I mean, in those 24 games, A.J. Brown has scored 17 touchdowns. He's had 8 games of over 100 receiving yards. He's had 9 games of 8+ targets. And the reason why I wanted to specifically mention targets with A.J. Brown is because in his career thus far with Ryan Tannehill, he hasn't been given a huge amount of opportunity like some of the other wide receivers that we're going to be talking about today. In fact, the statistic that I wanted to mention is that when A.J. Brown thus far in his career with Ryan Tannehill, in those 24 games, anytime he has surpassed 5+ targets, he's averaged 17.03 fantasy points per game in a half PPR capacity. Again, he has been unbelievable with limited opportunity, and that, though it's exciting to see maybe he can go ahead and exceed that opportunity and be an even bigger aspect of this fantasy, ranking system, but I kind of have hesitation, and that's why he's at number 9. This offseason, prior to Julio Jones going to the Tennessee Titans, I had full confidence that A.J. Brown was going to be a top 5 guy, but now that you bring in another guy that's going to be garnering 100, to 120 targets, they could end up, splitting this receiving time and splitting the targets equally, but it could end up hurting A.J. Brown, which we'll get to in a little bit. Either way, last season alone in the 14 games he played, 15.17 fantasy point per game average. If he ended up playing the entire season, he would have pretty much scored 240 plus points and been the number 4 overall wide receiver. But again, that was assuming he played an entire season healthy. Now, the thing that I wanted to point out with Ryan Tannehill is, of course, A.J. Brown's averages. With Ryan Tannehill, A.J. Brown has averaged on a per game basis 4.5 receptions, 7 targets, 77 yards, and 0.7 touchdowns per game. That just, speaks loudly to me that A.J. Brown is volatile. Though he has been consistent in his career, the volatility is still present based on his total contribution from receptions. Again, averaging only 4.5 receptions per game and 7 targets per game is not enough for a guy that needs to be a wide receiver 1. Only 100 targets is going to be hard to get to that wide receiver 1 conversation every year if you're not scoring an immense amount of touchdowns. But he's been able to do that as of late, which of course has carried him. Just looking at his production last season in terms of total yardage, receptions, and touchdowns, his receptions only accounted for 16% of his total fantasy points, yardage 54%, and then a 30% boost from touchdowns. Those are numbers you typically see from the tight end position, as they typically have lower, of course, reception counts, a little bit of lower receiving counts, but the touchdowns are always the biggest difference maker for tight ends. But A.J. Brown, having a guy that's seeing over 100 total targets and still being as needy of touchdowns, it speaks volume. Regardless of that, in the statistics that really matter in the case of A.J. Brown, we're talking about touchdowns, right? In the last couple seasons, he has gotten an ample amount of total targets down in the red zone. Last season, 12 targets for 7 receptions. Of course, I'd like to see that increase, but when you have Ryan Tannehill, of course, who has the ability to run, and Derrick Henry on your team, and a slew of tight ends that are always going to be catching down in the red zone, it makes it difficult for a guy like that to excel even more down in the red zone, but at least he's getting the touchdowns and opportunity he potentially needs. Last season, on the 429 total routes that he ran, he was targeted 106 times. That's a 24.7% target percentage. That's pretty good. I mean, 25% of the time that he's out there, Ryan Tannehill is looking in his direction, and we love that. Of course, having a 22.03% target share and market share from his respective team could, be a problem if, in fact, Julio really digs into that, but I expect there to be a pretty good number of targets up for grabs. Again, we're talking about Corey Davis leaving, who had 90 some odd targets. Adam Humphries had 30 some odd targets. He's gone. There are guys that are going to be missing in this wide receiver core. Jonnu Smith, of course, missing, that hopefully will give the ability to A.J. Brown to not only get more targets this upcoming season, but to at least fulfill a little bit of Julio Jones's potential so that he can pull coverage away from A.J. Brown. Again, that's the biggest prospect that I see helping A.J. Brown with Julio Jones. Of course, when Julio comes in, targets are going to be lost, touchdowns are going to be lost. There's going to be plays that are made on the opposite side of the field. But when you have a talented receiver such as Julio Jones, not only at least giving lessons to A.J. Brown, teaching him how to be an even better wide receiver, you get the potential of where if Julio Jones is on the other side of the field pulling double coverage and A.J. Brown is playing one-on-one in man coverage, he's going to torch just about anybody in the league, and he's already proven that throughout his career. Either way, as of right now, I have a lot of confidence in A.J. Brown. Again, he plays in one of the easiest divisions in terms of the wide receiver position. He's playing against the AFC South. The Indianapolis Colts he struggled with against his career, but playing against the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Houston Texans as of late has been very prosperous for him. In fact, playing against the AFC South in the first 2 years of his career, he's averaged 18.09 fantasy points per game against them. He has torched that division, and he's going to be better. Again, we're talking about a guy that had a lot of pain that he had to deal with last season with those knee injuries. He's going to be at full force. He's going to have Julio on the other side of the field and hopefully more potential targets going in his direction. He's going to be an absolute animal this season. We move on to our number 8 overall wide receiver, which is Keenan Allen. Again, I'm wearing the Chargers shirt right now. Again, I love any team that's in LA, but regardless, there's no favoritism here. Keenan Allen has proven time and time again that he is a reliable wide receiver, and specifically reliable wide receiver 1. That's why I have him as my number 8. Now, when I went ahead and I was doing the research for this upcoming episode, I wanted to really see how beneficial Justin Herbert was to Keenan Allen. And in fact, the statistics I found were quite jarring. The fact that Keenan Allen has been better in one season with Justin Herbert than he ever was with Phillip Rivers is a huge surprise to me. But again, this is a very welcome one, to say the very least. This is what I want to see. Now again, Keenan Allen has been a very stable wide receiver in terms of wide receiver 1 potential throughout his career. Again, this past season, he did miss a lot of games due to injury, and he finished as the number 14 overall guy. But prior to that, he finished as number 8 overall wide receiver, number 12, and number 3 in the 3 seasons prior. So again, since 2017, coming back from his ACL injury in 2016, he has certainly been a top 12 producer. Now, when I specifically saw the stats that Keenan Allen was producing with Phillip Rivers from 2017 to 2019, he was averaging 13.92 fantasy points per game, while he was averaging nearly 100 receptions a year. Again, in 2017, 102, 2018, 97, 2019, 104, and then of course this last year, he still ended up breaking 100 receptions, dealing with all those injuries. But either way, 13.92 fantasy points per game with Phillip Rivers may not seem like those are terrible numbers. Of course they're not. Those are good numbers for a wide receiver. But when we look at what he was able to do with Justin Herbert in just 11 games, when Keenan Allen was healthy and he was playing with Justin Herbert, he averaged 16.12 fantasy points per game. In those 11 games that they played together, 10 of those games, Keenan Allen surpassed 10 plus targets. In 4 of those games, he surpassed 100 receiving yards. And he scored 7 touchdowns in those 11 games. The average per game basis was 8.45 receptions, 12.18 targets, 83 yards, and 0.64 touchdowns. Those are unbelievable numbers, and that is why I have Keenan Allen where he currently is. The fact that he's able to produce as much with Justin Herbert in such a short amount of time just speaks to not how, of course, important Keenan Allen is to his offense, but how great Justin Herbert was in his rookie year and how he's going to expand on that with the new offensive coordinator and the new regime that has taken over the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, I wanted to specifically mention the new regime because Joe Lombardi comes over from the New Orleans Saints. He was the quarterback's coach there, learning under the tutelage of Sean Payton. We could potentially see Keenan Allen and Justin Herbert pretty much be the Michael Thomas, Drew Brees connection. A one-stop shop, send him the ball on every single route. Again, we know Keenan Allen's one of the most talented wide receivers in the game, one of the best route runners, if not the best in the league. If you go ahead and you just funnel him the ball, and they certainly did that last year, averaging 12.18 targets per game, he is going to be an unstoppable force in this offense, and I truly do believe that Keenan Allen is up for the task. Now, of course, this offense has improved this offseason. They've gone ahead and they've restructured their offensive line, spending a first-round draft pick on Slater, bringing him in, putting him at the left tackle position. You fix your center position, which was the worst pass-blocking center in the entire National Football League last season. You bring in an all-pro from the Packers. That's great. Corey Linsley. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything more. Now, on top of it, the other couple stats that I wanted to mention, of course, was Keenan Allen's target share. 25.33% in the games he played with Justin Herbert. On the 134 targets and the 497 routes that he ran, he pretty much caught the eye of Justin Herbert a pretty good amount of times, 26.96. So that's pretty much 27% of the routes that he ran, at least he was targeted on those, which is pretty significant numbers and probably higher than a lot of the guys we're going to talk about today. But regardless, when we talk about Keenan Allen, again, don't forget last season, even though those were the numbers he produced, he didn't play against the Raiders twice. The Raiders have by far one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League as it currently stands. And if he could have torched them twice, could have been a pretty big fantasy point total coming out of Keenan Allen, to say the very least. In fact, if he went ahead and just continued with his average that he produced with Justin Herbert over a 16-game basis last year, he would have had 260 plus points, making him a top 4 wide receiver, to say the least. But either way, I have a lot of confidence in Keenan Allen. Hopefully, you do as well now. All right, we move on to DK Metcalf as our number 7 overall wide receiver. DK Metcalf, funny enough, finished as the number 7 overall wide receiver last season, number 32 in his rookie year in 2019. But I truly do believe that DK Metcalf can stay consistent and continue to produce at a level in which he even improves this upcoming season. Now, even though he is, currently at the same rank that he finished last year, I do believe that the wide receiver position could even excel and continue to grow now that we saw so many records being broken in 2020. 2021 could be another year of breaking records. Regardless, DK Metcalf going into the 2020 season, there wasn't a lot of hype truly around him. Yes, he did have a great playoff game against the Philadelphia Eagles, but no one really expected him to come out and be as successful as he was right off the rip in 2020. The guy averaged 14.36 fantasy points per game in the 16 games that he played last year, had 10 games of 8+ targets, 5 games 100 receiving yards, and 10 total touchdowns. When he was targeted 8+ times last season, he scored 17.4 fantasy points per game in those contests. Again, those are pretty ridiculous stats to say at the very least. Now, again, DK Metcalf is another one of these players that, yes, he's not targeted as much as everybody else. In fact, he's probably not going to even get the most targets on his respective team this year, as Tyler Lockett has been, a top 15 wide receiver at very least average over the last 3 seasons. So Tyler Lockett, of course, he's going to garner a lot of targets. And though DK Metcalf is trying to, pull in as many as he possibly can, try to surpass that 100 target number this upcoming season at the very least. The biggest factor for DK Metcalf's success and the biggest boost to his potential is touchdown. Now, when we look at the red zone opportunities of DK Metcalf in the last 2 seasons, they've been great. 18 targets, 4 receiving touchdowns in 2019, 16 targets and 5 receiving touchdowns in 2020. Great. You got good numbers there. He's amongst the top in the league in terms of his opportunity. He's scoring touchdowns down in the red zone. That is fantastic. But what really separates him from majority of the pack is his end zone work and his deep ball threat. As of the last 2 seasons, no other wide receiver except for Tyreek Hill has had more touchdowns at 20+ receiving yards in the National Football League. Amongst all wide receivers, in fact, DK Metcalf leads the entire league since 2019 of receptions of 30+ receiving yards. On top of that, in terms of end zone targets, that means targets that pretty much had DK Metcalf standing in the end zone while they weren't even in the red zone. He was number 1 and has been number 1 for the past 2 seasons with 32 total end zone targets. This is a guy that is undoubtedly being focused on when we're talking about red zone play and feeding him touchdowns, and he's certainly been able to deliver thus far. Putting the touchdowns to the side, if we go ahead and just focus on his opportunity, of course, like I mentioned earlier, Tyler Lockett's going to have a lot of targets this upcoming season, but DK Metcalf did have 129 targets last season. Again, his catching percentage not as great as some of these other wide receivers, but nonetheless, he's a deep ball threat. A lot of them are going to be incomplete, whether it's double coverage, overthrown, etc. Of the 664 routes that he ran, targeted 129 times. That's a 19.42 target percentage. And in terms of his total market share and target share from his team, he had a 23.11%. Of course, we'd like to see that increase this upcoming season, and that's potentially the plan here. They bring in Shane Waldron of the Los Angeles Chargers to be their new offensive coordinator. Again, the Seattle Seahawks wanted to go ahead and shift their offense because even from the words of DK Metcalf this offseason, the opposing team just knew what they were doing late in the season because they had seen it so often on film, and their offense wasn't changing, and that's why they stagnated a lot. Now, when I bring in Shane Waldron, the whole question is, what is he going to bring to the team? He's been the passing game coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams since 2018. Now, to take it into perspective, what he's learned under Sean McVay is going to be huge for the potential development of DK Metcalf because they love to throw the ball in Los Angeles. Specifically, in the last 3 seasons, since 2018, the Los Angeles Rams have had the 12th, 3rd, and 14th most passing attempts year to year to year. Now, if we look at what the Seahawks have done since 2018, they've had the 32nd, 23rd, and 17th most passing attempts. They're in the bottom half of the league, while the Rams were significantly in the upside top half of the league. If, in fact, they can go ahead and pass the ball more, I know this offseason they've been saying they want to run the ball more. This is coach speak. They're going to say they want to run the ball more, and then they're going to hit you with play action, and they're going to destroy you with DK Metcalf, and that's just how it's always worked. Hopefully, bringing in a new offense coordinator won't taper off Russell Wilson in the second half of the season. This is 2 back-to-back seasons in which he gets to the second half, and then he begins to fall apart. Hopefully, he can continue to be a stud, and it'll certainly help DK Metcalf going into this upcoming season. He's got a lot of upside, and I think he maintains as the number 7 overall guy. We move on to our number 6. It is Justin Jefferson, another guy that is staying within his position that he finished last season. Justin Jefferson, in his rookie year, finishes the number 6 overall wide receiver and produced the second best rookie performance of the past decade. I mean, only behind Odell Beckham Jr. Was Justin Jefferson. That is unbelievably impressive, especially with the fact that there were, very little time for Justin Jefferson and, Kirk Cousins to build a chemistry. This is an off season in 2020 that did not see many practices, did not see many things other than a Zoom call, and, learning the playbook, getting the experience he, specifically needed took a while for Justin Jefferson. In fact, he didn't even start for the first 2 games of the 2020 season, which makes it even a bigger potential upside for what Justin Jefferson is capable of in 2021. Just putting in perspective, last season, Justin Jefferson averaged 14.39 fantasy points per game in the 16 games he played. In 9 of those games, he had 8+ targets. In 7 of those games, 100+ receiving yards. And of course, in 7 of those games, he scored touchdowns. Now, here's the thing. If you go ahead and you remove the first 2 games of last year, because again, he didn't start and he barely played 50% of the total snaps in those games. If you remove the first 2 games of the season, he averaged 15.76 fantasy points per game last year. Now, if we take a deeper dive in terms of total snap counts and the potential of a player like Justin Jefferson, like I did, I pulled out a magnifying glass and noticed that every time Justin Jefferson played more than 70% of the offensive snaps, he was a significantly better wide receiver. In fact, when he played less than 70% of the snaps last year, he only averaged 5.37 fantasy points per game. Now, when he played more than 70% of the snaps, 17.39 fantasy points per game. That is an unbelievable margin of difference. 4 games with less than 70%, 12 with more. Again, when you give a wide receiver like this opportunity and you give him the targets that especially he can at least garner and definitely develop into huge plays after the catch, turning them into touchdowns, forcing missed tackles. He's a pretty special player to say the very least, and I'm sure we've all seen that on tape. Regardless, these are the things that hopefully will continue for Justin Jefferson going into 2021. Again, he already out-targeted Adam Thielen last season. I mean, Adam Thielen did miss a game, and in the game that he did miss, of course, Justin Jefferson took over. I mean, in week 12, 13 targets, 7 receptions, 70 yards, and 2 touchdowns. If you give Justin Jefferson the ample opportunity, he is going to deliver on that, and he's already proven that last season. A couple of the things that we want to, of course, keep an eye on. Target percentage, target share. Last season, 24.22 for both statistics. So again, he's nearly getting 25% of his team's total market share, and on 25% of his potential routes ran, he was being targeted, which are great numbers in comparison to the majority of the league. On top of that, the numbers that need to increase for him, because the target counts, the receptions, the yardage, those are all great. The touchdowns need to increase, and I think that's going to happen this season. If we look at what Adam Thielen was able to produce last year in the red zone, 20 targets for 13 receiving touchdowns, while, of course, Justin Jefferson had 12 targets for 4 receiving touchdowns in the red zone. I truly do believe that Adam Thielen's numbers are going to go down, and we're going to see a positive boost for the potential that Justin Jefferson has in the red zone, that he has more experience and, of course, is going to be taking over. Now, in the last, 3 seasons since 2018, we've definitely seen the wide receiver position for the Vikings be a pretty valuable piece. In fact, we've seen twice in the last 3 years 2 Vikings wide receivers make the top 12 wide receiver rankings. Again, this last year with Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen both doing it. But again, in 2018 with Adam Thielen and Stefon Diggs doing it with Kirk Cousins. So we know Kirk Cousins is going to be able to produce wide receiver ones. He's certainly done it in the past. And Justin Jefferson is just going to have to continue to deliver. I think with the amount of opportunity he's gotten, and especially the way that the team started to develop and let him play nearly the entire game last season. I mean, in the back end of that year, he was getting about 95% of the offensive snap count, never coming off the field, and certainly getting the opportunity that he was delivering on, averaging about 18 to 19 points per game in that back end stretch. But either way, I think Justin Jefferson has got a huge opportunity and great upside. He's my number 6. We move on to our number 5, our top 5 at the position. Number 5 is DeAndre Hopkins, mainly because in 5 out of the last 6 seasons, he's been a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy, especially last year, number 5, the year prior, number 5. Then he's also finished as the number 2, 1, and 4 wide receiver. Again, this is 5 out of the last 6 seasons. He's been an unbelievable fantasy prospect, and I don't think he's slowing down. He's Mr. Consistency at the position. In fact, he has never missed a game in his career due to injury. Yes, he's missed games, but those are mainly because those are Week 17 games with the Houston Texans, and they didn't need to play because they had already secured a playoff spot. So go ahead, let him rest, and begin to get ready for the wild card weekend. Either way, DeAndre Hopkins is Mr. Consistency at the wide receiver position. And when we look at him on the draft board, if you are in need of a wide receiver and you don't want to take a risk, this is the guy you grab because he is certainly going to produce in the top 5 of the position every single career based on the opportunity he's gotten. And now that he's been with the Arizona Cardinals for a year, I think he can develop his play even more with Kyler Murray. Now, when we look at what he's done in the last 4 seasons, since 2017, DeAndre Hopkins has averaged 15.89 fantasy points per game. In that 62 game span, 52 of those games, he's at 8+ targets. And then in 24 of those games, over 100 receiving yards. And he's had 37 touchdowns in that time. Now, I wanted to specifically mention the 8+ targets in 52 of those 62 games because whenever DeAndre Hopkins gets 8+ targets, he averages 16.49 fantasy points per game since 2017. Again, incredible numbers to say the very least. Last season, he had 160 total targets. I think he caught 115 of them, which is a 71% catch rate, almost 72%. In terms of the wide receiver position last season, with 160 targets, he was only behind Stefon Diggs in total opportunity. So the opportunity was there. He just needs to score a couple more touchdowns, and he's going to be an absolute, non-debatable top 5 wide receiver. He was averaging 14.39 fantasy points per game last year. He kind of tapered off at the end of the year as Kyler Murray started dealing with injuries and missed that last game. So again, does play a big factor. But when you're getting 160 targets on 664 total routes run, you're getting 24% of the target percentage and nearly 28% of the team's market share for targets. Of course, the sky's the limit. Last season, his ADOT, his average depth of target, was pretty much on the lower end of his entire career. That means he was catching the ball far closer to the line of scrimmage in comparison to years prior, wasn't used as much of a deep threat, even though Kyler Murray was a fantastic deep ball quarterback last season. The things that, of course, DeAndre Hopkins had to deal with was a different offense, a different scheme, and he certainly delivered on it. Last season, he had career highs in yards after the catch and forced missed tackles. He was able to become a receiver that wasn't even just a great route runner and a guy that can find separation, but he was catching the ball and making players miss and getting extra yardage where he typically didn't do throughout the rest of his, the past of his career with the Houston Texans, where he was, typically a deeper threat, and it was just catching the ball and falling down because he was instantly being tackled because they were double covering him at all times. Regardless, the only thing that I see DeAndre Hopkins being held back by is, of course, touchdowns. If you can fill that piece of the formula and allow him to excel, that's going to be great. Now, Kyler Murray last year, he had 25 rushing attempts in the red zone that led to 9 rushing touchdowns. If those numbers are going to continue, then, of course, you're not going to see DeAndre Hopkins have the upside of being the number 1 guy anymore. That's going to be far gone. But if you can go ahead and get him more opportunity down in the red zone, we can certainly see him be a stud. Now, if you compare 2017 and 2018 to 2019 and 2020 in terms of his red zone opportunity, in 2017 and 2018, he had 44 targets for 15 receiving touchdowns. In the past 2 seasons, he's only had 31 total targets in the red zone and 7 receiving touchdowns. That's been the biggest difference maker for his career. Hopefully, by bringing in more wide receiver talent like Rondale Moore, AJ Green, bringing in James Conner, this offense can at least adjust, help DeAndre Hopkins out a little bit more if you get another wide receiver or more of a threat in the backfield to at least pull a couple defenders into the box. You could see DeAndre Hopkins have an upside, but outside of that, you need him to score touchdowns. But regardless of whether he scores, double-digit touchdowns, he's still my number 5. We move on to our number 4 overall wide receiver, which is Stefon Diggs. As of right now, Stefon Diggs is coming off of a year in where he finishes the number 3 overall wide receiver. Great year. But Stefon Diggs has been inconsistent in his career. Prior to coming to the Buffalo Bills, he was a guy that finishes the number 20 wide receiver, number 11 again, like I mentioned earlier. Him and Adam Thielen were both wide receiver 1s in 2018, and then the season prior to coming over to the Buffalo Bills in 2019, finishes the number 21 overall wide receiver. So he's been a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1, but he had an incredible boost of value this past season, averaging 16.56 fantasy points per game with Josh Allen. In those 16 games, 14 of those games, 8+ targets, 7 of those games, 100+ receiving yards, and he had 8 total touchdowns. He only had 2 games last season of less than 8 total targets, and in those 2 games, one of them he scored a touchdown, and the other he had over 100 receiving yards. This is a guy that, regardless of the opportunity he was given last season, was delivering, and this offense, of course, took over. We had Josh Allen, that was an MVP candidate last year, only was, pretty much snuffed out by the fact that Aaron Rodgers went for over 50 total touchdowns last year and led his team to the number 1 record in that division. But either way, Stefon Diggs has a lot of potential, and I certainly can see him delivering on it. I mean, if you compare what he had in terms of opportunity last year and compare it to 2019, it's a huge difference, especially once we consider in 2019 with the Vikings, Adam Thielen was injured. So why not give Stefon Diggs more opportunity there? That's why he was doing all these cryptic tweets. He knew that the potential that he had was unmatched by a lot of other teams, players. So why not give him the opportunity? He took the bull by the horns and has honestly delivered for many of us who invested in him last year. Now, of course, you drafted him way later in drafts last year in comparison to what you'll have to get him for this year. First round, second round, potential opportunity here depending on the scoring format. But either way, they gave him the opportunity. He had a 25.19% target percentage. He had 29.02% of the target share. That's probably some of the most in the National Football League, I think only behind a guy like Davante Adams. But either way, down in the red zone, 15 targets, 5 receptions. In comparison to 2019 with the Vikings, 5 targets and 1 receiving touchdown in the red zone. So again, it plays a huge difference. Another thing that plays a huge difference, the fact that this offense does not have a running game. The lead running back for this team is Josh Allen. We know that. Zach Moss, Devin Singletary, it doesn't exist. They do not have a running game. The offensive coordinator has bought into that fact. That's why they bring in more receivers. That's why they build their offensive line around guys that can pass block. But either way, the Buffalo Bills last season passed the ball 59.19% of the time, which ranked 12th amongst all teams in terms of pass percentage and 11th amongst all teams last season in total passing attempts. This is a team that wants to pass the ball. They're passing it 60% of the time, and the running game outside of Josh Allen is pretty much an afterthought. When we talk about the amount of opportunities that are going to be available, sure, you're bringing in a guy like Emmanuel Sanders, but you're losing John Brown. Isaiah McKenzie's probably going to lose targets. Andre Roberts wasn't. I mean, what, he had like 5 targets last season? He's gone. There's like a 15% target share that is up for grabs. Certainly, Gabriel Davis could step up into that. Emmanuel Sanders could step up into that. I think Stefon Diggs, his total target percentage could stay the same, and I hope it does. Again, this is a guy that's averaging, 17.67% against the AFC East. That's a tough division. If Xavier Howard leaves, of course, that helps him when playing against the Miami Dolphins, but you still have Gilmore there. Certainly have a lot of tough defenders, especially in the secondary in this division. But as long as the opportunity is there, Stefon Diggs is going to improve. I think there's going to be potential regression from Josh Allen. Again, you can't finish as the number 1 overall quarterback and have another successful season that's even better. I think we'll see a little bit of regression, and it'll, of course, affect Stefon Diggs. That's why I have him as my number 4, but nonetheless, he's an absolute stud this upcoming season. We move on to our number 3 wide receiver for this upcoming video. It is the thumbnail Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley finishes the number 4 overall wide receiver last season. The 2 years prior to that finishes the number 20 and the number 25. Again, this is what I was mentioning when in regards to Terry McLaurin potentially taking that step up from the mid-20s to being a top 10 wide receiver. But regardless, Calvin Ridley had an incredible year in 2020. 16.48 fantasy points per game in the 14 games that he played. 11 of those games, of course, 8+ targets. 8 of those games, 100+ receiving yards, and he had 9 total touchdowns. Since coming into the league in 2018, in the games that he had been targeted 8+ times, he's been averaging 19.09 fantasy points per game. That's in a 19-game span, by the way. Either way, Calvin Ridley, of course, took over the number 1 wide receiver position for the Atlanta Falcons last year. And though it came as a surprise to some of you, we saw it coming because, again, Julio Jones has dealt with injuries in his career, and it was only a matter of time until Calvin Ridley honestly just surpassed him. He had the talent and he had the potential, and the target share was beginning to grow in his direction. In fact, last season, he had himself a 24.7% target percentage and had pretty much almost 23% of the team's total target share. Again, when we look at what he's been able to do in his career, he has scored 26 touchdowns in the 3 years that he's been in the National Football League. 26 touchdowns in 42 total games, of course, not counting the games that he left early with injuries. That's a pretty ridiculous amount. Now, when we talk about what his red zone target percentage has been, he's had 39 total targets in the past 3 years, leading to 17 of those touchdowns coming from within the red zone. Again, this is a guy that has been developed and has been absolutely utilized down in the red zone, unlike Julio Jones has been for the Atlanta Falcons, and hopefully that continues with the absence of Julio Jones. Now, I bring Julio Jones a lot because, again, he has been an absolute animal for that team. He is a legend nonetheless, and he's going to go down as, one of the greatest wide receivers of all time. And what he's done in the last 10 years for Atlanta is beyond incredible. Since 2011, he's averaged 163 targets, 105 receptions, 1,591 yards, and 7 receiving touchdowns per season for the Atlanta Falcons. That's 255 fantasy points per season average. I mean, again, that's 163 targets that are up for grabs. And though a lot of those targets were taken last season, you bring in a guy like Kyle Pitts, you go ahead and continue to develop Calvin Ridley. Sure, you have Arthur Smith. He's coming from the Tennessee Titans. They don't have a Derrick Henry on their team. Yes, Mike Davis could be, a guy that they want to run the ball with a lot. But Calvin Ridley is going to be the number one on this team. They are going to absolutely utilize him. And he already has a built chemistry with Matt Ryan. And they've gone ahead and proven that over the last couple seasons. Without Julio Jones in the lineup, a lot of people may be worried. Hey, listen, Calvin Ridley sits on the opposite side of the field. He pulls secondary coverage in terms of the second best wide receiver and or safeties. We don't really, have that much of a market share as to what he can potentially end up doing without Julio in the lineup in comparison with Julio in it. That argument is irrelevant. I've went ahead, I've crunched the numbers. With Julio Jones in the lineup in the last 2 seasons, Calvin Ridley's averaged 13.6 fantasy points per game in those 20 games. In the 8 games that Julio Jones has not played and has been injured, since 2019, Calvin Ridley's averaged 16.25 fantasy points per game. He's a significantly better wide receiver without Julio there. With more opportunity comes more potential, and the upside is definitely there, and he's acted upon it every single time that he's definitely been given said opportunity. But either way, Calvin Ridley, an absolute animal, plays in a division that, of course, I love. The NFC South, in terms of the wide receiver position, wide receivers certainly do produce. Since coming into the league in 2018, Calvin Ridley's averaged 16.15 fantasy points per game against that division alone. So again, he gets to play them 6 times a year. Those are numbers that we definitely don't want to miss out on, especially against those secondaries that he has absolutely torched year in and year out. Calvin Ridley is going to have the opportunity, again, 163 average targets up for grabs that Julio has been taking in that past decade. And then you go ahead and add that with the fact that Calvin Ridley is already a guy that's found success in the red zone. The sky's the limit for a guy like him. That is why he is my number 3 at the position. We move on to the only 2 guys that, as of right now, I'm comfortable with in a half PPR drafting in the first round as a wide receiver. Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill is unbelievable. In 3 out of the last 4 seasons, he's been a top 4 total fantasy wide receiver. Since 2018, he's averaged 17.85 fantasy points per game. In those 41 games, which he's been healthy, 21 of them 8+ targets, 11 of them 100+ receiving yards. In the games in which he's averaged over 8+ targets, 22.03 fantasy points per game. He is an unbelievable fantasy prospect. But you may be wondering, Andrew, you haven't talked about touchdowns yet. Well, I'm not slowing down. Since 2018, in those 41 games, he has scored 37 total touchdowns. He's had 10+ receiving touchdowns in 2 out of the last 3 seasons, specifically because in 2019 he was injured. That's why he finished as the number 30 overall wide receiver. He missed, 4 to 5 games that year. Now, if we talk about his opportunity, of course, you're going to be matched up with Patrick Mahomes. You have the best fantasy quarterback and best quarterback in the National Football League throwing you the ball. Of course, you're going to succeed. But when we talk about Tyreek Hill and his potential, it's above all others because he has so much upside in the touchdown game. Of course, the targets, the receptions, they're going to be there. But he's not even the most targeted receiver on his own team. Travis Kelce's out-targeting him year in and year out. So, of course, Tyreek Hill, the second fiddle on that offense. But his ability to catch the ball deep and score touchdowns separates him from the entire National Football League. In terms of receptions of 20+ yards, again, in the last 2 seasons, he's number 1 in the National Football League. In fact, when we talk about the amount of touchdowns he scored just in the red zone, he's top 10 in terms of total targets in the red zone from last season. He had 8 receiving touchdowns in the red zone last season. My goodness, the numbers continue to build for him. Sure, again, like I mentioned, only 21.5% of the target percentage and only barely 23% of the total team target share. Those aren't great numbers, and it does potentially create volatility. If, in fact, we have a game in which Tyreek Hill isn't scoring a touchdown or isn't having the breakout game, there could be some games in which he's an unfortunate, fantasy prospect. I mean, there are just as many games of him scoring 25 plus fantasy points as there are of him scoring less than 10 fantasy points. And that's a legitimate statistic. There's just as many. I think it's 9 of 25 plus and 9 of 10 or less in just the past 3 seasons alone. So the volatility is certainly there. But I'll take that volatility any day of the week, because I'd rather have a guy give me 7 points in a given week, but then in the following week win me the game because he scored 27 to 30 points, So I'll take that any day of the week. Now, when we go ahead and we try to close out the argument for Tyreek Hill, of course, besides the fact that he's getting, 135 targets last season, scoring double-digit touchdowns, getting a lot of work in the red zone, the yardage is there, of course, because he's catching the ball for deep target threats. He's always got the ability to run the ball. Since 2018, he's averaged about 18 total rushing attempts, 141 yards, and about 1 to 2 touchdowns per season. So if you go ahead and just kind of break that down, he's going to get some work in the backfield, continues to, at least increase his volume, reduce a little bit of the volatility if he's getting more yardage or potentially sneaky touchdown in a given week. That's always going to be there. This is a guy that has scored touchdowns at will since coming into the league. I mean, I'm not even talking about, the times in which he was a punt returner and kick returner, because that doesn't exist anymore, right? But he's had himself, 5 punt return / kick return touchdowns. Like, anywhere he is put on the field, he is a difference maker, and that is, of course, why he's been such an incredible fantasy asset. Finishing as the number 1 and the number 2 overall wide receiver in 2018 and 2020. So again, as long as this man stays healthy, he is certainly going to be the top of his position. But he's going to play second fiddle to our next wide receiver that we're going to mention. That is Davante Adams. With the return of Aaron Rodgers to the Green Bay Packers, we find ourselves with Davante Adams, who he himself, similar to Tyreek Hill, had an injury-ridden 2019 season, but in 2018 and in 2020, he finishes the number 1 and the number 3 overall wide receiver. So again, he's had his pedigree of getting himself within the conversation of being in the number 1. So it shouldn't be a surprise that he's here, especially considering the fact that since 2018, in the games that he's been healthy and played fully, that's 40 games total, he's averaged 18.2 fantasy points per game. In 35 of those games, 8 plus targets, 17 of those games, 100 plus receiving yards. In the games in which he's targeted 8 plus times, he averages 18.94 fantasy points per game. If we look at what he's done in just the last 23 games, including the actual NFL playoffs, he's averaged 20.8 fantasy points per game. In 19 of those 23 games, 10 plus targets. He is an absolute unstoppable machine, and with Aaron Rodgers coming back, them doing their quote-unquote last dance, they're going to take the league by storm and absolutely try to torch every single person in the league. If we just go ahead and look at the amount of touchdowns he's scored in just the past, 5 seasons, it is an unbelievable margin, and no other wide receiver is even relatively close to him. In the last 5 seasons, since 2016, he has scored 58 total touchdowns. 4 of those seasons, 10 plus. Of course, the one last season, 2019, or 2 years ago, 2019, in which he had sustained an injury and missed multiple games, he did not surpass double-digit touchdowns. But when he's healthy and he's going, he is a double-digit touchdown machine thanks to Aaron Rodgers. And now, if we just look at the last 21 regular season games, he has had 41 red zone targets for 18 receiving touchdowns. I mean, that is an unbelievable number, on top of the fact that he led all receiving options in 2020 in red zone targets. So again, the guy is getting his opportunity, whether it's around the field, but specifically down in the end zone. This is a guy that, he scored like 18, 16, 17 touchdowns last year. Those numbers are unbelievable. And the fact that you can accompany any performance that he does with a potential touchdown, on top of the fact that this guy is getting himself so many yards on the, through the air, on top of the fact that last season, his 145 targets led to a 31.05% target percentage and a 29% total target share and market share from his own respective team. In terms of the target percentage, the 145 total targets on 467 routes, that was the number 1 amongst all receiving options in the National Football League last year, with at least 20% of their team's total snaps as routes run. But either way, we're talking about Davante Adams, my number 1 for this upcoming season. Again, Aaron Rodgers coming back. I mean, Aaron Rodgers has an effect on number 1 wide receivers. We know this. I mean, since 2008, since Aaron Rodgers took the helm from Brett Favre, I mean, his number 1 wide receivers have averaged 132 targets, 87 receptions, 1,200 receiving yards, and 11 touchdowns. So why not continue that with Davante Adams? I think Davante Adams is talented enough, and they've got enough anger in their tank to even boost that beyond. On top of the fact that they play against the NFC North, one of the worst divisions, Davante Adams has torched them year in and year out. Since 2018, in the 15 games that he's played against them, has averaged 18.47 fantasy points per game. Can't get any more better than that, to be honest. So either way, I appreciate you guys spending your time here today. Let me know down below in the comment section what you guys would have your top 10 wide receiver list looking like. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate you guys supporting the channel. Make sure you click the like button down below and prepare yourselves for tomorrow. We're going to be doing a mock draft, getting more in line with what the offseason is truly about, strategizing, drafting, and being able to take advantage of drafts and opportunities that are given to you by your league mates. When they're making mistakes, we're going to take the opportunity and we're going to develop that into success. But either way, thank you for watching today. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.